Hi, my name's Moraene Roberts. I'm an activist with the organisation ATD Fourth World in the UK, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference. It's very important to be able to say that poverty is an act of violence against the poor. But many people just don't accept that. They don't consider it to be an act of violence. However, anything that denies someone the right to a normal human life is a violation, and it creates a cycle of violence in which people live. They're treated as less than human, which violates all of their human rights. They are made to feel less than human, less than valued, and that internalizes a kind of anger within them, which can come out in how they treat themselves or how they behave around others or how they treat the system within which they live. And then that's often reported, it's often documented, and then people say, you see, these people are dangerous, these people are not like us. And so the cycle begins again of fury, of anger, of distancing oneself from the poorest. And many of the myths around who are the poor people, what do they do, how do they live, comes because of that distance. Unless you encounter people, unless you meet them, unless you speak to them, you don't really get to know anything about them other than what you may see in a newspaper on the television. It's very important that people who live in poverty are given opportunities to show the best of themselves, to show what they can do, what they can contribute. Because if they don't have that, then everything anyone ever hears about them is negative. Everything that's spoken about them continues the myth that they're not real people. When people are given opportunities to show the best of themselves, they grow, they grow. They are able to demonstrate what skills they have. When they're given opportunities to gain more skills, then they accept it, and it gives them a kind of dignity that they wouldn't otherwise have. To prepare how people are treated, often what happens is that people say, we know that these people are living in poverty, we know they're struggling and having difficulties, but we can come up with solutions to that. But when they come up with solutions that don't involve asking the people themselves who are suffering, those solutions hardly ever work. Often they cost a lot of money, and the idea begins with how can we help people and ends up with a complete oppression on them, because everything that's set up to help them comes with conditions. You must be at a certain place at a certain time, behave in a certain way, look a certain way, speak a certain way, act a certain way. And often that's not possible if you've suffered a lifetime living in poverty. And then people will, organisations, the government and so on, will say, look, we gave these people opportunity, they didn't take it, therefore their poverty is their own fault. And again, that perpetuates the idea that people in poverty want less, care less, don't have ambitions or aspirations, that they're content to be recipients of charity, of money from the state, And that's not the case at all. If you ask most people, they say, this is not a life, this is an existence. I want a life. And more than wanting a life, I want a life for my children. Most parents want better for their children. What wealthier parents want is better things, better places to go, better experiences. What most parents in poverty want for their children is a better education, better chance to have a job, a better chance to show that they can excel. And they're denied that again and again and again. What can be quite cruel is the fact that what's said about people in poverty is that they take from the state, from charities, and give back nothing. And that's such a falsehood, because amongst poor communities, who babysits for each other? Who feeds people when they have no money or no food? Who looks after the poor, the sick, when the state can't or doesn't? It's normally other people in poverty who do that. My daughter has been my carer for 20 years. And people say to her, why don't you get a proper job, a full-time job? Because they think what she does for me has no value. But without it, I couldn't live independently. I couldn't go to places. I couldn't do things. I would be dependent totally on the state. And then people would say, oh, she should look after her mother. So when you're in poverty, you can't win. No matter what you try to do, you can't win. An example I can give is when I was receiving a benefit, a non-work related benefit, I was told that if I continued to do voluntary work, I would receive a lower rate of benefit. If I gave up my voluntary work, I would receive £40 a week more. £40 a week is an enormous amount for someone who's living on existence money. But it meant giving up my freedom. It meant giving up my right to contribute. It meant giving up what gave me dignity and pride. It meant being imprisoned in my home, having more money, but having less life. And that's something that happens to lots of people in poverty. Even if they try to help someone else, if they're receiving a benefit and they say, my elderly neighbour needs some shelves fitted, or they need a babysitter, my neighbour needs a babysitter, so that they can go out of the house, or even a babysitter so that the poor exhausted mum can have a bath in peace. If someone reports that this person on benefits has done this, the assumption is they've been paid for it, and therefore they're defrauding the state. Immediately that's reported, their benefits are stopped, and they are left with nothing while it's investigated. However, when a big company defrauds society, when a political organisation defrauds society, there's very little repercussion to that. When a company decides to uproot from the UK and go to a country where they can better exploit people, pay them less, treat them badly, there is no comeback from that. That's accepted as meeting the market. You're allowed under market conditions to treat people really badly in a way that is quite criminal. But the slightest deviation when you're on benefits, the slightest attempt to do something for someone else, and you're penalised. And it can lead to imprisonment. It can also lead to you being destitute for so long that you lose your home, you become homeless. It can lead to you having to move away, losing all your friendships, all your connections. It can, when you are sanctioned or denied benefits, it can mean you can't pay things that you would normally pay. For example, your television license. Many parents can't afford to pay the television license, but not to pay it is illegal. And lots of lone mothers that we've spoken to have said their fear that if they're caught not paying the TV license and they are put in front of a judge, they'll go to prison. What we know of that is once they are imprisoned, their children are taken into the care system. They may be separated, put in different care homes, different placements. And then when the mother comes out with a criminal record, it's very hard for her to get her children back. And there is so much documentation about the damage that the care system does to the children. Again, it's one of those things set up with good intentions that ends up destroying people's lives. And it's so hard to climb back from that. It's very difficult to imagine how terrible systems that are set up to help people can affect their lives. To be in receipt of benefits, you're condemned, you're discriminated against, you're looked down upon. And people don't realise that many of the people who are in receipt of state aid are working. Some of them working 2 jobs, 2 part-time jobs. Some of them working on something called a 0 hours contract. You can be asked to be in work for 2 hours, say to set up a cafe or prepare food, and then you're told you're not needed for a while, so you sit around unpaid, and then you come back when you're needed to serve food and clean up, and then you have to sit a while there's no customers, and come back when you're needed. But all of those spaces in between you're unpaid for. So people often have 2 jobs, or they're in receipt of a top-up benefit. But when people hear that you are getting benefits, they then consider you a lesser person. It's a horrific experience, I can promise you that. It's a horrible experience. And the feeling that nothing you do has any value, nothing you say has any value, because you're a lesser person and therefore not entitled to be listened to. We realised that the things that were being said about us in the media were wrong, but we didn't know enough about each other to speak up. We worked together as activists, as ATD Fourth World activists, but we didn't socialise or meet each other otherwise. And so ATD Fourth World set up a residential in the setting of the house in Surrey, which is called Frimhurst, for us to spend time talking to each other about our lives. And what we discovered is how much we actually contribute. Almost every headline we could counter with an example of what people do. We're not scroungers, we do contribute. We have different actions that we take within our community. One young man mentors younger boys in his rugby club. My daughter is a carer. Someone else was working in a charity shop. A couple were looking after an elderly lady whose services were no longer providing enough for her. And at the end of this, we had a list written up of what we do. And the young man who mentors in the rugby club said, it's all very well we know this, but other people don't know it. How do we tell them who and what we are? And that began a series of residentials for us to be able to have professional photographs taken, to write texts about what we do in our lives, what are the roles that we play in our family, in our community, and in political fields. What do we do? It began with that. It grew into an art exhibition, and it evolved further because the exhibition was never taken out without the people who were part of the exhibition going with it. And people would say, oh, that's your photograph, and you say you do this, how do you do that? We had opportunities to speak to people, to put a face and a voice to the photograph and the text. And then because there was a wider interest in that project, we started to get together in groups, not only ourselves, but other groups of people who are fighting poverty, living in poverty, and travel with the exhibition, but as a way of poverty experts, giving people a chance not to see professional poverty experts, but the people who live it and talk to us on a human level. And it's amazing how little people really knew about what life in poverty means. For example, we use the word sanctions, people being sanctioned. If you miss appointments at the benefits office, if you're late, if you phone in sick and the message doesn't get to where it goes, all of your benefits are stopped, all of them. You are left destitute until it's sorted out. And that's sanctions. But when it's read in the newspaper that people have been sanctioned, they think we've been told off. We've not been told off. We've been left to rely on food banks or starve. It's such an injustice. It's impossible to believe how unjust it is. But it's important that we are able to show the general public that a person in benefits isn't a person sitting watching television 24 hours a day, isn't someone with nothing to offer, isn't someone that refuses the opportunities to contribute. Often milestones are put in our way and that stops us. Again and again and again, the attempts of people in poverty to contribute are held back by the criteria by which they have to live to meet the means to get their benefits or to get help from social services or to get help from other organisations. And what's not recognised at all is what is that loss? What is lost not just to the individual, but to the wider community, to the world? We have something to give, and we should be able to give it. One of the difficulties people in poverty have is not just having their voice heard, but their viewpoint and their opinions. And there's a lot of research on poverty, but often it's, we are researched, we are not part of the research. Often people are over-researched. They're researched on different angles of their life, different researched on housing, researched on health, but nobody is taking on board the baseline that what causes the need is poverty. And that to do research on poverty without the full participation of people in poverty means that it never really, really works. It never gets to the bottom of what's going on. It's only when researchers, organisations and people in poverty get together as equals, as equal contributors, that you can really begin to design something that looks at solutions to poverty. If you ask most families who live in poverty, most individuals, what do they need to have a better life, they will be able to tell you. But not only will they tell you what they need, they'll tell you how it needs to be delivered to them. Because you can give people opportunities in a way that completely disdains them, going back to the "we know what you need and we'll provide it for you" system. And that they'll say there's lots of research that says this is what you need. But that research hasn't come from us. It hasn't come from people in poverty working together with researchers. We don't want to be under the microscope of researchers. We want to be standing next to them, communicating with them, participating not just in giving examples, but in saying what kind of questions we'd like you to be working with. What are you going to do with the answers? How can we contribute to the analysis? How can we contribute to the final report? What can we do with it? It's very, very important that that aspect of people who live in poverty is not continuously ignored. We're not just here to give you a testimony of how awful life is. We know what's important, we know what needs to change, but we need the people who have priority to actually take that on board and validate what we know and what we can contribute. That would make a change in the world that hasn't existed so far.